Asian research. Before the lecture starts, may I gently remind you to switch on your mobile phone and other sound devices or turn them into silent mode. Thank you. Without further delay, may I invite the Acting Director of Central Buddhist Studies, Venerable Sik In Hong, to give us an introduction speech. Venerable Sik In Hong, please.
Thank you. Well, I'm most happy to be here to introduce to you Diego, and I was more impressed by his GPS ability. Why I was impressed by his GPS ability? Because we was taking him around the campus, and we took him all the way back to our center in May Hall. And he could find his way back here with no difficulty at all. And you know how difficult it is to find his way around in the university. But I want to introduce him as Diego as the Chief Operation Officer and Head of the Mind and Life International. And obviously, the Mind and Life Institute was established 25 years ago in America. And it has been the forefront of international movement acting as a catalyst in the promotion of rigorous scientific study of contemplative study, that is obviously meditation or mindfulness, and bringing together modern science, research methods, and ancient Buddhist teachings to enhance the understanding of human behavior. They have been building cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural bridges, promoting the development of research centers in major universities. Hopefully we will be connecting with him in the future, that we will be, obviously our center has been trying to do some research in mindfulness practice too. So Diego, it's now your time. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. It's a particular honor for me to be here, and thank you very much for Venerable Hin Hong to, first of all, invite me, and then also to organize all of that, and to all the volunteers who have been very diligent in setting up all these wonderful papers to find this place, which makes it also easy to kind of have your GPS activated. So I was cheating. Today's topic is going to be on the science and contemplative practice. Now, of course, that requires me to sort of introduce myself a little bit better, so that people understand why is it that I am doing all of that, and how is it that I am connected with all of this. As you can see, I studied pharmacy. I'm a pharmacist by training, but my special interest was actually in psychopharmaca, because I was really interested in seeing and come to understand what it means actually how the mind operates. And I thought that by researching all these wonderful substances that are having some effect onto the mind, be that sleeping tablets or psychoactive substances, antidepressants, things that work with schizophrenia, and all of these wonderful substances that somehow are having an effect on consciousness, I came to learn that that is a complete wrong idea to get to understand what consciousness is. And so after many years of studying and vigorously studying, also working with addiction and people who have problems with their mental patterns, it became clear that, for instance, addiction is not something that is really just physiologically suddenly firing up and then you have an addiction. It's a mental needs you to become addicted first and foremost, and then after that you end up into a situation which obviously is physiologically demanding for more substance, and that's how substance abuse starts coming. It became clear to me that somehow something is not quite right in the understanding of how mind operates. And then when I started researching other venues and avenues and understanding of what consciousness is, I got really drawn into the Buddhist understanding of what consciousness is, how it operates, and how you can affect it, and how you can maybe transform. And one of the fundamental differences that I found was within science, we were always talking about, and particularly in psychiatry, is, okay, a mind that is dysfunctional is either schizophrenic, sleepless, anxiety, all these phenomena could be really easily explained, but there was no explanation about a healthy mind. What is a functioning mind? What is a consciousness that is really capable? What is it that defines when it's flourishing? When there is obviously a quality in the mind that is creating more well-being and maybe more happiness. And when I encountered the Buddhist approach to that, I knew I needed to know more. And that, of course, led me to discovering wonderful beings, teachers, yogis, and people that are really practicing what they're talking, first of all, and secondly, the results of their mere presence were so overwhelming, at least to me, that I knew I needed to understand more of that. And I then decided to live in Dharamsala in India for 11 years and studied the Buddhist dialectics, which is sort of like the foundation of how, at least within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it is understood how you can begin to understand what consciousness is. But of course, practice is the main element that you cannot study. You have to practice it. And the more you start researching that, it becomes evident that you're never going to really taste what it means, what practice is, by just looking at it from outside. And this is a classical example of what we are doing in the area of research now. Research is mostly looking at consciousness and mental processes that from outside seem to be something that we think is happening and is a third-person observation, but we completely forget about the first-person experience. What is it that the person is experiencing? So with that in mind, I would like to begin maybe with a short meditation for all of us. Has anybody not done any kind of meditation? Now, if I had asked this question about maybe 15 or 20 years ago, maybe not in this setting, but probably only 5 people would have raised their hands and would have said, yes, I have meditated. Because 15, 20 years ago, it was still kind of like considered to be, oh, this is a weirdo. This person is not quite healthy. Something is not quite wrong. And maybe the ones of the 5 that were raising their hands, they were maybe understanding mediation as opposed to meditation. So why don't we sit down and just for a few moments, just observe. I'm happy to sit down for that too. And just sit comfortably. You don't have to be in a particular position that is uncomfortable. Just try to sit comfortably and observe the breath. Observe the breath, how it's flowing in and how it's flowing out. And by each breath, try to keep your attention to the moment where breath is beginning to inhale and where it's beginning to exhale. Just that. It's a very simple exercise, but somehow it's not easy. Just observe what is happening. What is happening? Ask yourself that. And observe. And then slowly bring this short meditation to an end. Now, what was happening? What is happening to a mind when we try to calm it, when we try to focus it, when we try to keep it at a particular object, as simple as the breath that we're all having every day and every moment in our life? It's obviously very difficult to keep that object of the mind focused. And this is one of the troubles that in all the research that we have been doing over the last many years, it is very difficult to really identify that object that we are investigating. It's even more difficult for us to hold it firm and stable on a particular object. And I will come back to that throughout the talk, that you will see where certain difficulties are in that research, and why it's not so easy, first of all, to do that kind of research, and secondly, where are the limitations. So, how did all that minor life emerge? Where did that all come from? And with that I would like to begin our presentation, that it originated with the dialogues that the Dalai Lama was having with different kinds of scientists about certain topics. It could be topics such as sleeping, dreaming, and dying, and we published a book about that. It could be another topic such as quantum physics and the background of the understanding of what is quantum physics and what has Buddhism to say about interdependence. It were topics such as destructive emotions. Now, during the meeting of destructive emotions, the Dalai Lama then challenged the scientists and said, well, we have talked enough about all of the interesting things. That is, of course, wonderful and it's very interesting, but he put actually a challenge to the present scientists, mostly psychologists and emotion researchers, saying, well, is there any way that we can really begin using the technology that nowadays is available to research what is happening and how beneficial is meditation really? And if it's beneficial, then we might have to look at ways how we can make it available in a secular environment, in a secular setting. So that catalyzed the whole row of challenges, of course, to the scientists present, but then also we started creating a strategy and implementing that in different areas where these research maybe can emerge. And what Mind Life is actually not a place. There is an office, but it is a network of people that creates programs that somehow advances all of the research and different initiatives that are related to both natural sciences and well as humanities. So that's just a sort of framework. Where did all that come from? And so if we look at 1992, what kind of research was being done there? We had a whole group of people being brought into the research, and these scientists came mostly from the USA, and they brought their equipment up to Dharamsala and went up to Triund. I don't know if you have been up there, but it's quite remote, and had those yogis who are there in retreat for 15, 20, 30 years and be exposed to all of these different equipments. They thought it was more of something funny than really, what is this purpose about? I mean, why would you want to research something that we know works? Why do you want to do that? Now, if you look at this photo is quite remarkable, because this was at the school that I was studying. It's the dialectic school. And as you can see, one of the scientists by the name of Francisco Varela is wearing a hat. It's actually a cap. And at that time it was 16 electrodes. And you have a bunch of people who are looking at him, and he is just cracking up. And everybody else is laughing. Because they put on this cap. It's not because it looks somehow funny. It's because they couldn't understand, why would you investigate the mind up here when the mind is down here? So that's the challenge. We are not only looking at challenges from cultural, but also conceptual. It's very different. Now, of course, that's 20 years ago. And in the meantime, that's why it is really possible to have all this research now being done. It led to new areas, new methodologies, new caps, new ways of looking at a brain that is in operation. And so we're not looking at the mind at this point, we're looking at actually the brain. And that was an article in National Geographic, which was published in 2005, I think it was in March. And so what we did at this point is bring these experts into the lab with their quality of controlling the mind. These people were really able, not like at least us or me, to just sit there and then the mind goes all over the place. These people were really able to do a task that was being given to them and said, okay, just do that for the next 2 minutes or 10 minutes and keep that focus, that attention, that mental attitude, that whatever challenges we gave them, and then only you could see what was really happening to the brain. And of course, I'll get to that later, what is the correlation between the brain and behavior and structure and all that. But, so, this is another guinea pig. You can see the profile. So here we have 256 electrodes that are based all around us, and what is being measured is brain activity. And it is evident that certain tasks, like me talking at this point, or writing, or thinking, has different areas of the brain that are active. You can only see the activation of these different areas, but you don't know where exactly it is happening. You can sort of gauge more or less with the EEG which part of the brain is actually active in which area, but what you can really measure is changes. When I'm speaking and now I'm looking down and I'm looking up again, these changes you can really trace in the brain what that is doing. And so there were other people that were dragged into the lab, such as and this is one of the main researchers by the name of Antoine Lutz, whose research is, I'll be basing a lot of the data that you will be seeing coming from that. And then we have another guinea pig by the name of Mathieu Ricard, who is sitting here on a different machine. And this is the machine that actually measures more where something is happening. But the challenge here is really to look at an activity that is sustained. You can't measure the changes. So this is where the research really is then already looking at different parts and different activities, and it's not just one thing that is being looked at, but there are many things. And another person that we have been very grateful to be involved in all of that is Mingyur Rinpoche, who I understand has been in Hong Kong. And so these were the experts that were really able to maintain a certain mental activity over a certain period of time, and then only you could sort of look at, oh, that's different in that other brain. And over the last several years, and this is what we have been observing, and this is related to what we are doing, it's the Mind and Life activities. In 2000, we had a sort of a very minute amount of research being done that has mostly to do with yoga papers that have been published. Another area is looking at research that had the word mindfulness in it. And these are just a few examples that I'm picking here. And the other one is just meditation research papers that have had, this is a worldwide analysis. And so up to 2004, there was not much happening. But since 2004, a lot has started emerging. I mean, we have over 227 papers in 2010 that had the topic mindfulness in it, or meditation is 170. What happened here? This is a benchmark where Mind Alive created the Summer Research Institute for young researchers that want to research this area, and we bring in experts from everybody can participate, but it's quite competitive. You have to have sort of a lab in it, and you have to be either invited or you have a lab that supports you for that. And these researchers sit together with the expert contemplatives and do practice and start experiencing what it actually means to meditate, like we just did shortly before. And Venerable has been one of those. And so there's something happening. And of course, I guess the interest of people that have come in such large numbers is showing that something is happening more than just beyond us. It's really obviously something that we are being interested in. Now, what's different in these people? Now, if we look at different kind of activities that these brains of these long-term practitioners and experts have, is when they are in baseline, and this is just in rest, you do not have a huge difference in wavelength. Now, this is all EEG measurements, where you look at which part of the brain is active, and is it very active or is it slowly active, and there are different kind of wavelengths that are being measured in the brain, and this is now the gamma oscillation for practitioners over anterior electrodes. So these are the electrodes that are measuring more in the front part of the brain, if you are in meditation, if these people are in meditation or not. And so what you do have is different people, meditators versus non-meditators. So if you tell a meditator to go into his meditative state, now of course the question becomes very interesting, and I'll address that later on, is what kind of meditative state? You can see that there is a shift, quite dramatic, from the blue line, that is just, I'm resting, I'm not doing anything, I'm just basically thinking about nothing, if possible, but just nothing specific. But then going to a state of meditation, suddenly it peaks up. So, and what happens to the people that are not experts? They remain basically from a rest state. They go up into something that try to focus, but it's not really that gamma oscillation is not really activated. Now, what does that mean, gamma oscillation? It seems that gamma oscillation is very much an indicator how well the two parts of the brain are actually communicating with each other. That's one indicator. Now, if we look at where that exactly is happening in the brain, that something is different, then you have people who have been practitioners, these are A and B, when they are in rest and they go in from the rest state into meditation, there's quite significant changes of activity. The darker the color, the less activity, but this is where it really shifts from here to here. And then you have different parts of the brain that is, for an expert meditator, quite different. Whereas somebody who has not done much practice or not practice whatsoever, there is a shift from rest to meditation, which is not dramatic, it's not significant. You can't really see where that is happening. Now, this research has been 7 years old now. Of course, nowadays we have come, or the research has started pointing out many different other areas that are active or are changing, and you can really start looking at different parts of the brain, be that the insula or so. Now, one of the big critiques that, particularly me coming from pharmacists, is often that, well, all this stuff that we are giving is just placebo. Now, placebo, is that a non-effect or is it an effect but we don't know what it is? Now, you're all familiar, I suppose, with placebo effect. You give somebody a medication that has a substance in it, and then another group of people gets a medication that has no substance in it. And both groups have an effect where they, even the ones that do not have a substance, think, well, that must help. It has helped me. So there was a test or an experiment that was being done. Sometimes certain substances have a little bit better effect if they're really in that tablet than the ones that do not have any chemical substance in it. For instance, pain. Now, this experiment has been done with pain. Now, of course, it seems that we think, or we start perceiving that because we are taking this tablet, they must do us good. They must be having some effect. Now, the pharmacologic effect is then being said, well, okay, this substance obviously is really working better than another one. Now, what was being done is being questioned, well, how about if we give the substance hidden and the person doesn't know, as opposed to open application? So this is what has been done as an experiment. This person is having chronic rheumatism, which is strong pain, and so the person was receiving it intravenous, this medication, but some people did know that both of them did not know if they're receiving it as a substance or as a non-substance. And so the effect is quite dramatic to see here. And I'll try to explain that. The open injection that the doctor comes and gives that substance to the person is this line. So the pain intensity actually decreases because the person sees that this medication is being applied. The other line is the person doesn't know that the medication is being applied because it's just an intravenous drip. No effect change whatsoever. So something is obviously happening to the mind when we are receiving a medication. And it doesn't matter if the medication is a substance or a non-substance. So this is critical. This is very important because it obviously shows that the mind is involved in all of that. The perception is involved in all of that. So when we start looking at medication for chronic pain, such as rheumatism, it is very important who the doctor is, how the person interacts, what is the condition of the person receiving that medication. Now when we go into another thing, which is experimental pain, heat on lower leg, and this is what we have been doing. Sometimes it's given here. You get an electrical shock, or we as guinea pigs going into the scanner, we get electrical shocks, or we get heat that can be also given at the lower leg. And depending on if we do meditation on just observing 20 minutes, mindfulness and breath, what happens? It is quite interesting to see that, I'm sorry it doesn't show very clearly here, but there is a group of people that get training, and then after the training, when we look at the intensity of the pain, when you have a rest state, and you get that electrical shock or that pain, it's kind of like quite equal for people that are experiencing just at rest or are receiving, that they're having attention to pain, to the breath, sorry. But the ones who have gone through the training how to really cultivate that exercise on focusing on the breath, their decrease in pain is quite stronger. And this is a personal rating, how it hurts it's very unpleasant, but it's we don't really know how strong it has been. Now here, when it is, this is the intensity, sorry, and this is the unpleasantness, and there again we experience a complete decrease in not only the intensity that we are perceiving, but also the unpleasantness that we are perceiving, if we are able to sort of train our minds in a certain way. That is research that is just about to be being published, and it has mostly to do with mindfulness and breath. And I'm showing here a few different kinds of meditation practices, techniques, and methods, just to show that there's not one kind of meditation alone. It's quite complex, it's very varied, there are different parameters that need to be considered. Here we did another experiment. It is obviously something that we can somehow observe from outside what is happening within the brain. And I'm shifting here the focus again on what is the personal experience. Can we, or can people who are really experienced and have maintained a certain degree of clarity or stability of their mind, are they able to sort of really trace the first person experience that correlates with the third person experience? And this is the big debate within science, because often the understanding is that first person explanations are not really objective because they are first person. Now often the argument there is also, well, maybe third person might not be as objective because it lacks the subjective experience when it comes to consciousness. I agree when it's about an intensity of light or of structural capacity. We don't need first-person experience for that to really measure that intensity of the light or the structural rigidness. But when it comes to consciousness, it's quite important to include that perspective of the experience. We know when we are not happy. Maybe it doesn't show from outside. We know when we are not focused. Maybe it doesn't show outside. But that's a critical piece. So what was being done here is trying to observe, and the person, we were sitting there and we had just kind of like an object, and we were trying to focus on that and maintain the focus on that task that we had to do, and gauge our own personal experience of what we feel we were really on task or not on task. And this is the result. You can see here with there's a correlation of 0.69, which is extremely high considering. The gamma activity that I was mentioning before is the blue line. So the blue line is let's start here, and then suddenly our sense of intensity of really being focused at that object was increasing and getting better and moving down. Somehow there is a correlation, obviously increased gamma activity here, decreased gamma activity, but what has that to do with the actual capacity to focus? And that's why it was important to include the first person experience of the person that was doing the experiment, to show I felt that I was really focused on the object, or I was not so focused on the object. That's the red line. Now the red line was tracing, I felt, oh, I was quite focused here, and then going up, and so you can see a very remarkable capacity to correlate our personal experience here, and then, oh, I lost my focus, and then build up again with somehow what's happening to the brain with the gamma. So something is happening there, but some areas are not correlated and others are correlated. So it's not 100% measurable quality to say gamma active is really focused and gamma not so active is not so focused. There are other factors that need to be taken into the consideration, which again, for the research, is quite challenging. It makes it very complicated if we start looking at all of that. But there are obviously certain indicators that are correlated to that. Now, what about sustained attention? So we started now going into a little bit of the results in sustained attention. Now here, the different people had to... Is that bothering you a lot? That kind of like rushel? It's okay? Okay, that's right, it's better now. What we're doing here is people that are adepts and less adepts. More adepts and less adepts. And we try to look at 3 different kinds of mental states. And this comes really clearly from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. One was called focused meditation, which is tingedzin, or focused attention, when you try to focus on an object. It could be the breath, it could be an external object, it could be an internal object, but the quality here is really keep the focus on a particular object. The second one is open presence. And that is something where you just observe to what is happening at that very moment. And you don't get sidetracked by an idea and a concept and a distraction of any sort. You just let those ideas pass through your mind as if a bird is flying through the sky. No trace, it just occurs. And it's something that is quite difficult to hold. So that's why it's important to bring in the experts that are able to hold that state as open. And the third one is lumaten, which is neutral. You don't think anything particular, you just try to be as neutral as possible. Now here you can see that 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, up to 10 minutes, if we do that with different groups of people that are experts and not experts, that obviously something is different. If you look at, let's say, the blue line up here, or let's start with the red one. The red one is the focus of less adept people decreases over time. It's still kind of one of those qualities that we are trained, particularly in modernity, to sort of hold on to a particular object. It depends on which one we choose, but there is kind of like a decrease, but not so bad. But when it comes to open presence, the blue line, just try to not think. Have just the ideas go through the space of your consciousness. It doesn't need even 4 minutes. It's already very much down, and it decreases. It's a very difficult practice. That's why these practices are only taught at least in the Tibetan tradition. Mahamudra, for instance, is one of those, and are later on being taught. And then when we look at neutral, even neutral decreases. We can't not think. We cannot just be neutral. Suddenly an idea comes up, my child, or my mother, or I need to shop, or anything just starts suddenly arise, and it's difficult to hold that. So even neutral is difficult. Now that's people that are not so adept. But if we look at the other people that are adept, that have had a training, a constant practice, so this is remarkable. It's quite different. So there is obviously something that is changing. Now, of course, when we look, is that change something that is maybe genetically determined? Oh, these yogis, these spiritual people, they're anyway wired the way they are from the beginning. Or is that something that we can train? And this here indicates that when we look at, for instance, anxiety, and this is research that has been mostly done around mindfulness-based stress reduction that has been developed over the last 30 years, mostly in the US, and it's now, of course, all over the world, because we have a problem with lack of mindfulness. And that is being used, this whole program, it's an 8-week program, it's being used in different settings, be that for stress reduction, or for addiction issues, or for cognitive therapy for depression, anxieties, sleepless deprivation, and all of that. I mean, there are many different forms of, let's call them, meditation applications in the clinical setting. Now here we looked at meditation, how meditation began to reduce anxiety. In July 2006, these were the people, meditators and non-meditators, had sort of a similar degree of anxiety. It's interesting that meditators were a little bit more anxious here, but that's probably just because they were nervous. I don't know. But what's significant here is that there is a huge degree, a decrease which 3 months later, after this 8-week program, which is 2.5 months, they were obviously better able to deal with their own anxieties. And another test was being done, which has mostly to do with meditation effects on antibody titers to influenza vaccine. Now, this is a test that has been done where you burn somebody and then you put that, you create blisters, and then in these blisters you extract the serum that is created in these blisters and see if the vaccine that has been given a few days earlier has had an effect. And it's very clear that people with a sort of a calmer mind have had a stronger amount, more antibody in that serum than non-meditators. Same protocol is more based on the idea of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Now let's move to another topic. And this is something that has more to do with a more recent kind of research. What I've been speaking about so far is mostly about research that had to do with fundamental faculties of the mind, to be focused, to not be focused, to be sort of open, or have maybe some other qualities like neutral. Over the last 2-3 years, particularly, we started really looking at what other qualities can be looked at. And one of them is, for instance, compassion. Here is a quote by Mathieu that Mathieu and I were working with a scientist called Tanya Singer, who is really very much interested in the idea of empathy and compassion, and how these two qualities of the mind have an effect on different results when it comes to, for instance, pain, dealing with pain or stress. Specifically, though, going to look at loving kindness and compassion. And so here is a quote how we try to sort of inspire and direct the practitioners or the non-practitioners to see, okay, this is what we hope you were able to do. Here, what we have tried to do for the sake of the experiment is to generate a state in which love and compassion permeate the whole mind, with no other consideration, reasoning, or discursive thought. This is sometimes called pure compassion, or non-referential compassion, in the sense that it does not focus on a particular object to arouse love or compassion. Or it's also called sometimes all-pervading compassion. Now, what did that bring out? So, this research was studying experts in compassion meditation. And with modern technology, you can really look at what is happening in a brain that is trying to have this all-pervasive compassion, this degree of non-referential compassion. Now that really is a big challenge if you look at what traditional texts say about compassion. You can't have compassion without having an object of compassion. So there's still kind of like a challenge in all of that. But what is being observed is that people, when we have this degree of unconditional compassion, or loving kindness, or compassion that is really directed at a kind of pain that is being perceived outside, it seems to activate different parts of the brain, which are very specific to these areas, mostly around the insula and hippocampus. And here we see, and this is an interesting concept, is it something that just suddenly happens? You are compassionate or you're not compassionate? or is it something that can be even gauged? So here we were trying to do is look at compassion in a way as if we were, let's say, pushing against an object. Imagine you're pushing with 100% force. Of course, that just goes away. Let's say you just do with 60%. Somehow that muscle is trained. We know when we're really forceful, 100% pushing, when we're just pushing 60% or half, or a third, 30%. That's the same with compassion. It's like a muscle trained. We can really activate it stronger or less strong. And this is something that it's not only for experts, you can also train that. So you can see how these different areas in the brain start like strengthening and manifesting stronger by this stronger sense of compassion that you're having. So, yes, that's what we did. And then obviously, when we start looking at, in the setting of game theory, it is also an idea that distribution of justice or wealth in certain games, you can actually look at how compassionate and methods that have to do with compassion, you have a larger distribution of wealth and communities like money or mostly money in this case, than just doing reappraisal techniques. So there is a difference that is measurable outside of the setting by doing one method, such as reappraisal, as opposed to compassion. And the next one is also looking at, for instance, heart rates. So these are all now different methods that we are looking at, or is being used as to look at what is happening in a person from all different kinds of angles. It's not just eye movement, or is the person feeling like I'm compassionate, or I'm focused, or I'm doing that. You also look, for instance, at heart rate. That looking at heart rate during compassion or neutral. And so the compassion-induced changes in heart rate much higher. So this is not what we expected. Why is it that a compassionate person has a higher heart rate than a person that is sort of not so compassionate? You would expect the opposite. It's actually the capacity to upregulate and downregulate, which is the quality that people who are trained are better at, although not what we expected to do. And then here we have another degree of so what was being done then is observing these different things and then compare them with each other. So here what we have is across compassion and neutral. So if we compare what is happening in a person that is really strong compassion and which parts of the heart and the cardiovascular system is being activated, we can see that in the insula there is a higher degree of activation than in other parts. And this is another, this brain sort of corresponds to this layover. It's many tests with many different people, but then kind of like compare them with each other. And so you can see that experts are actually, the coupling parameter is positive, which means they are able to correlate and down and upregulate much easier and much quicker. Whereas if you look at the novices, they might not have so much arousal, but they also do not have that much control about it. Now, we have been speaking about long-term practitioners. And is there a correlation about the amount of practice that one is doing in relationship to the degree of, for instance, what I mentioned at the beginning, the gamma power during the initial baseline? And so it is, and these were people that have been meditating 10,000, 20, 30, 40, 50, even 60,000. Now 60,000 hours of meditation, active practice, it's probably about 30 years of active practice. So it's a long time. I don't know. Maybe some people have that here in the room, but the majority of the people sort of that we have been being able to bring into the lab been somewhere around this context. A 3-year retreat is about 10,000 hours. So that's how many years these people have been in retreat. So we can see that there is obviously a strong correlation about the gamma activity in regard to the amount of hours that have been done in meditation. Now that doesn't mean the quality is being measured. You can be 3 years in retreat and come out with even more dysfunctionality because you haven't really been able to meditate during those 3 years. So that should not be taken as the more hours the better. It's really also a question of the quality. Now, can these beneficial effects of meditation in novices be achieved with short-term training? Is that something that you can say, okay, now we have been speaking about those people who are 3 years in retreat, come out, and now is that something that just you need to go through these amounts of hours? Or is there something that we can already say, okay, short-term practices seem already to have an effect? And if short-term practices, the question of course arises, what kind of practices and for how long? And I mean, this is a question that I often hear. I mean, is 2 weeks already enough to get some improvement? Well, it needs to be seen if you want your scientific validation. But personally, I think it's always good. And you might find out. It might be tough at the beginning. Here what we have been looking at, and this is the research that was being done in the context of cancer therapy, and this is at the Alberta Cancer Board that Linda Carlson was doing in 2008, and published these data, is we have a profile of people with anger. This is the anger profile. If you look at people that have been doing MBSR before and after the 8-week intervention of MBSR, you can see that these people from up here, their degree, and this is of course not something that you can measure from outside. How can we measure from outside the degree of anger that a person has? That's something that the person, him or herself, is experiencing. So you need to ask the person. But the person, after an 8-week intervention of mindfulness-based stress reduction, he or herself feels less angry. Yes, I suddenly realized that, first of all, I am angry. That's an exception that we need to do. But secondly, also, I just can control it better. I'm not just bursting out and slapping my kids all the time, or having fights with my partner. At work, I'm getting less annoyed. So there is obviously a change. Now, what else is happening for anxiety? You know, somebody that has huge degrees of anxiety in cancer, that's evident. We have anxieties. If you have cancer, you know, well, this could be my final direction, and I don't know how it's going to progress. But even for these people, the anxiety has decreased considerably. And if we look at the green line, we can see that that's just a form of therapy that is coping mechanisms, but it's not really the meditative practice included in that, which is a critical piece, apparently. Now, which piece is it that really in the MBSR? Is it the yoga, or is it the meditation, or is it the breathing observation, or is it just kind of like having time to yourself? That's all to be investigated. But there are some indications that active practice seems to be affecting a degree of anxieties and angers. Another example which was being looked at these people is, for instance, blood pressure. When they're at home, they measure the blood pressure and write it up, and then week number 1 till 8, during the intervention, and you have a group of people that do not get an intervention of MBSR, it is obvious that that's the degree of activity that we would like to sort of be, that seems to be treatment group that has a low blood pressure is somehow there, and the control group that has a low blood pressure is somehow similar. But the big difference is this one, where a treatment group that has a high blood pressure moves down. So there is obviously something that is not only mental, like anxieties or fear or sleeplessness, and there's obviously also physiological changes in a person that you can even measure as a blood pressure. So that's where all these blood pressure exams, and then here we have another person that is, for instance, the group that is controlled against. They sort of start off more or less the same with a high blood pressure, but they don't really change. Some even go a little bit up because, I mean, cancer is something that is worrisome and it seems to have effect on physiological. Now, what does that leave us with? And this is really, it's general. I'm not talking here to scientists only or Buddhist people who are in Buddhist studies. I try to bring these different things quite lightly together, and then maybe in the later discussion we can look at other things. But it seems, in the psychological level, it has some improvements in the treatment group. 26% feel less stressed. 49% think even that my degree of depression is not so bad, or it has degree. I mean, that's half. Every second one has less sense of depression. And mood disturbances, even 68%. And this is all in the context of cancer. Then, what is also obviously happening, and this is one of the big problems that mostly you start having, is worries and rumination. Constant kind of like, what's happening to me? What is happening to me? And why to me? And so it seems to decrease that too. And people have more mindful attention awareness. These are a few sort of results in view of the medical clinical setting. Now let's move to a different topic. Obviously the brain is involved in all of that, but which parts of the brain are we talking about? So when we look at these different brain activities, the brain is somehow involved in expressing behavior. We can't have a behavior without a brain. That seems to be quite obvious now. But the brain activity is very much determined by obviously what we were just looking at. So the mental process of meditation, of contemplative practices, mindfulness training, open awareness, compassion training, seems to have an effect on the brain activity. So we can look at brain activity, how that expresses behavior, and then, and this is where I'm leading you all, is look at brain structure. I mean, it could just be that the brain is sort of acting up in a certain area, but it doesn't really have an effect on brain structure. Now, as I was saying before, the brain activity during meditation is very much linked to a particular area in the brain that has control mechanisms and are somehow linking emotional responses, cognitive functions, with each other. And then there's the temporal pole and the superior temporal gyrus that has been sort of identified to be of particular interest, to be further researched when it comes to controlling emotions and controlling different functions of the brain. And that is possible to now look at it in action with fMRI. The thing that I showed you at the beginning. At the beginning with this big magnet that looks at how certain parts of the brain are active. It's a very complicated mechanism. I had the privilege to study with the inventor of that at my studies in the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And he got the Nobel Prize for that. And it turns out last year it saved him his life because they could use the fMRI to find out what was his problem. So This research now is really incredibly high tech, because we can look at which part of the whole body is active and when. We don't know exactly, that depends then on the machinery. And then there's another area, which is the anterior cingulate, which is very important for other control mechanisms, and particularly bringing these different informations to each other and distribute it back into being conscious about that, or just having visceral effects. So these are the two parts that I've been mostly talking about now in meditation research. Now, what about brain structure? Is that something that is obviously... there are two sort of very distinctive parts in the brain that are relevant to being looked at. And we have all maybe seen a brain that has been sliced. There is the grey matter, and then there is white matter. Now, grey matter is mostly composed of neuronal cell bodies, dendrites, glia, and capillaries. Now we have to imagine that the neuron is around the cell nucleus, which is this part. And there are many, many dendrites that are sort of reaching out to other nerve cells. And then there is a long sort of main cable, like this big fat one, that goes into other regions, and there it reaches out and has synapses. So most of the electrical impulse that is being received by axon is being received here, and then is being sent through this channel into the axon, into the synapses. And then that stimulates the next group of cells. And so we have billions of cells in the brain alone. And these cells are obviously not static. They change. They change either by having more dendrites and mostly more synapses, communicating with more, let's say one cell communicates with more cells, or it can actually make the electricity, the impulse, going from one end to the other much faster. So this was up to about 1998, the idea that this is how the brain is structured. Up to about 20, 22 years old, your brain grows, and from then it's only downhill. You just lose cells, you're basically doomed to have no brain at the end. But as it turns out, that's not true, because there is a third part, how we are learning. And that learning is by creating new cells. And that is in the hippocampus, which is sort of like a temporal lobe, fluorant part here, where new cells are being constantly produced. And these cells gradually grow out and reconnect with new cells. And that's something that actually you'll be surprised even continues after death, because these cells are still kind of like growing. If you maybe you're dead, but not for long after that. But obviously, it's an ongoing process. So that brought up the whole topic of neuroplasticity. The brain is not a fixed structure, so there's hope. We can either create new connections, we can learn new things, and it's quite evident that an ongoing mental exercise and practice is really benefiting different parts of the brain. Now, what does that mean? Where is grey matter? Oh, just to answer one thing, what is grey matter? Where do we find that grey matter? It's in the outer part of the brain, and it's mostly these myelin sheath that are around the cells, which seems somehow to make the set of nerve cells a little bit grayer, darker. So that's why it's different. The function is all over the same, but these are a very important part of where grey matter seems to be. So grey matter is on the surface of the brain. It is not only on the surface of the brain, because we have that all sort of You have seen a brain, so you know how shriveled it actually is. And there's also inner parts. There are internal structures. Now, when we talk about meditation or mental training or exercises that are of cognitive nature, we are talking about, for instance, many issues. And these issues are, for instance, each study assessed a slightly different metric of grey matter. That means that every person has a different amount of grey matter, depending on what the person knows, has learned, is operating with. So there are thickness. Some people have a thick, that's why they call that thick-skinned or thick-skulled. They have different volumes. We know the different sizes of heads, and there's different densities. Then each study enrolled practitioners from different traditions. Now this is critical. These studies is not true, and the amount of, let's say, grey matter assessment and thickness is different for each practice. Be that insight meditation or Zen meditation or the Cuenca style or mindfulness meditations or whatever. It's very important to understand that these differences are always related to the kind of practices also that people are doing. Another one is the amount of practice, as I said before. That has a big influence on the structure and on that only one little scale that we're looking at now of grey matter. But the fact is that these practices have all affected grey matter. And quite in certain exercises and research, quite considerably. But one of the problems is that these structural changes might be transient. It's not given that once you have learned something or that you have sort of developed a certain quality of focus, and just take that as an example, that you will be able to maintain it if you don't practice. And that's why practice is so important. Now, all findings are not pre-existing. There are random individual differences, and they have something to do with practice. And I'm not saying only with practice of quantity and what style, but remember, quality is very important. So that's more or less for my first hour. I've been trying to do a little survey of data, research, findings, issues that have to do with the structural question, the research per se. Now this is all obviously on the level of each individual. Certain individuals are more inclined to do that than others, but the question arises, of course, also, how much do outer conditions matter? Now, so far we have only been looking at the individual and personal practices and differences and all that. But there's obviously that certain beautiful settings, landscapes, are more suitable for practice than others. If we're in a hustle-bustle subway station in Central, it might be a little bit more challenging to keep focus. Sometimes even to be compassionate. But that obviously is a factor that we should not forget about it. Now, something that really drew my attention is this other graph. Causes of disability in the United States and the European Union. And if we look at that, it is obviously that we are living in a society, in a setting, which is conditioning us. Now, when it comes to degrees of disability that are sort of considered impeding us, our well-being, our degree of, let's say, comfort, we are struggling with also the other side, that is, well, we might be we're not functional. This is a research that has been kind of like a meta-study, where all the findings and research has been looked at. Why do people go sick? Why do people not go for work? And it is telling for modernity that we have depression. 17% of the causes for disability are because of depression, other psychiatric conditions, Alzheimer's, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, migraine, and only this other capacities, that could be accidents or floods or whatever. Half of the disabilities that people are not able to be well, healthy, or going to work, because that's how most of these findings are being brought out, are obviously because there are mental problems. And I am 100% sure, from all my experience with these problems, that this is only the beginning. We are actually having a mental disability epidemic. And so that's why it's so important to really look at what are then the treatments and the preventions for a mental breakdown. Of course, working less could be one. Another one could be maybe have friends or engaging with others. That's all there too, but we need to really take this serious. And that's actually why I have become, that's why I was drawn into that, because having dealt with mental peoples, in a way, since my studies in the psychopharmaca, I was really interested in, well, there must be another treatment than just preventing symptoms. Now, of course, the question arises, well, let's see how maybe happiness is conditioned by money. And if we look at how many people are really considering themselves to be happy, it seems, yes, in 1945, 50, and every 5 years, there was a sort of like a degree of improving. And this is, of course, a European statistic. It's a United States statistic, somehow related to after the Great Depression and the Second World War. The people were kind of like, okay, about 25% of the people were considering themselves happy. So it increased a little bit up to a certain point, but that was more or less then ebbed out. Not much increase. Whereas if we look at the GDP, real income per head, has been going up. But why is there no correlation? The idea would be that the more money, the more happiness. Obviously, that's one myth that seems to be being debunked by that. And there are many more of those doubters, but I'm not going to go into that. It's not the topic of this talk today. And then the next one is, well, maybe marriage buys me finally happiness or gets me happiness. So if we look at how the anticipation is about creating happiness, that's kind of like before the big excitement, we're really getting more and more happy. And somehow, at the marriage, but then it's somehow the delusion starts settling in, and the disappointment, and no accident that many divorces start happening after 5 to 7 years. Now, let's turn this whole thing around. Does widowhood produce unhappiness? Now, that's obviously a tragic event. And if we look at outer conditions, somehow do matter, but I mean, there's a point where, and of course, this is strongly also conditioned by, it's not only accidents, but also you're accompanying a dying person of cancer or of other causes. And then there's kind of like a deep sense of life satisfaction is negative, because okay, that person has died and there is grief and but somehow it comes up again. You know, we are wired to sort of deal with that. So that leaves us up to the question, well, what is it then that is really creating happiness or dissatisfaction? Now, one of the topics that I have been mostly struggling is the idea, why is it that we do believe that selfish behavior creates happiness and is the cause for our well-being? Because when we start looking around, it is quite evident that, and here I'm getting maybe even politically incorrect, is that when we look around, how much effort we put in to amass wealth. And the scientific data really proves that after a certain degree of wealth, it's not going to be more happiness. We're stuck already in that. So the existing paradigm that we are following is that the more wealth, the more for me, is going to be better. Now, why should that be? Because we are not a being. We're not a being that is independent of the others. We are codependent. We are interdependent. And so what we did in the context of the Mind and Life conferences is we looked at, is it possible to have altruism and compassion in an economic system? So we had a conference last year with the Dalai Lama participating, where we looked at what is the underlying understanding in economic systems. And it's, to a large degree, egoistic behavior is rewarded. And it's a short-term reward we're getting. It might be an addictive behavior, but it's really the question here was what we were trying to raise here is, well, what else? What else do we have? Is there something that we may be completely wrong with our assumptions? Is there something that we think, as I said before, environment and personal gratification is really what we're here for? And of course, being in a Buddhist study setting, I thought, well, let's look at, I'll bring that up here because I think altruism is really something we need to look at more deeper. And we need to understand how important it is to be really taking care of others. Because fundamentally, that's what we're here for. We are here because others were taking care of us. So this is something I would like to explore here in the next 20 minutes, where we look at if the fact is, does altruism exist per se? And so there is going to be some maybe experimental evidence. Now, over the last 15, 20, even 25 years, many experiments have been done that have shown and have been trying to test the empathy-altruism hypothesis against plausible egoistic alternatives. And by this is meant, okay, we have the possibility to behave egoistically, or we can behave in group or in favor of a group. And I'm not going to go into that, but there is evident, abundant evidence that results have been strongly supportive that empathy altruism hypothesis is more beneficial for, of course, the group, because somebody is supporting the group, but it's not. It's for also on the individual basis. Now, the tentative conclusion of that is that the human motivational repertoire is actually not limited to egoism and self-interest only. But empathic concerns produces altruistic motivation. And this motivation is extremely powerful. It's not by accident that each time that we do a practice, we have to motivate. We have to think in terms of motivation. Now imagine if the motivation is just me, I, me. Then of course that becomes sort of self-deflating. But if the motivation is for the good of others, for multiplying the goodness or the benefits or whatever you want to dedicate it. So it is very important to understand that that is a critical piece in how we function and who we are, and how that will affect our, and I'll come back to what I said before, brain structure, how our behavior will express itself, and how we just are. So the implications is that we need to take altruistic motivation into account, even in economic systems. Now here we have another, and how does that relate to now what we've been discussing before? When we look at neural neuronal networks for pain in self and empathy for pain in others. That also is an experiment that, by being in this fMRI and looking at how we respond to painful signals or things that we think is going to be acted on us, all the pain is coming to us, be that the trigger that we get, then we share the pains of others by activating neural networks underlying our own pain processes. We did experiments about looking at, let's say you're in a state of meditation, or you strongly try to visualize the pain that you're experiencing on your foot. And then we compared that with the actual pain being inflicted on the foot. It's so similar that's these patterns in the brain, by experiencing the pain and by actually just visualizing and thinking about the pain, that it's a clear indication we can make ourselves sick by just having the visualizations of the pain. But we can also heal ourselves by looking at what is really happening behind that. So when we look at these different processes, when we're kind of in the scanner, we get to see something like this image up here. And then you see that that person is just going to cut herself into the finger, or cutting causing pain. It's a visceral response. These are what's in specific terminology is called the mirror neurons. They just fire up because it's like our pain, but it's actually not our pain. It's just what we see. But the so-called interoceptive cortex, this is the part of the cortex that is really able to look at ourselves in what is it that we are experiencing, even when we are not experiencing, but we're just seeing it, plays a crucial role in representing feeling states regarding the self as well as others. And why am I saying that? Because it is important to understand one's own feelings and their relationship to empathy. So when we look at, and this is a test that we have been doing over and over again, and has been done not only with us but with many others, is this 1 second stimulus. How do you feel right now? You know, you have to sort of look at it. And then you get this image. And then you have to rate again yourself. Has it been positive experience or has it been a negative experience? Just seeing an image like that modulates what you are actually feeling. Something like this angry dog can really give us a sense of fear, or we don't feel very comfortable. But when you see a cute little, I forgot the name of this animal. Seal. Thanks. A little seal. We suddenly feel much better about that. So there's obviously something that, in relationship to our outer world, even if it's not us that are in touch with that, or we are able to cuddle that little seal, is an immediate response, and it colors our experience and a sense of how we feel about that. So now what happens to people who do not have the capacity to understand their own feelings? So people with deficits in understanding their own feelings, which is the term is alexithymia, show less activation of this interoceptive cortex when they have to feel their own bodily and emotional states. So it's very important to understand how you really feel yourself. And that's why practice is so important. And that's why it's important to calm your mind and stabilize your mind in order to be able to perceive that. Because if you don't perceive how you feel, how are you going ever to understand the other person? So they also show, these people that have alexithymia, they also show a lack of empathy associated with a lack of empathetic brain responses in the interoceptive cortex. Now, the summary is that empathy training should therefore first concentrate on training people to become aware of and understanding their own bodily and emotional states. Now, this is not some kind of Buddhist teacher who came up with this idea. This is really research in the area of emotion modulation and responses in modulating. Now this is also why in the Buddhist context, compassion training begins actually with understanding suffering and your own suffering. And only like that you start beginning to develop empathy, and then out of empathy, of course, compassion. And it's 4 years ago, we were at we organized a conference in Mayo Clinic, which is a huge clinic, it's one of the leading clinics in the USA, where we became aware how difficult it is for professional people working in the setting of hospital not to burn out. There's so many people that are either completely exhausted in the hospital or are cold. They do not respond anymore to the suffering that they see. And we started really looking at that. And with the scientist Tanya Singer, myself, and a few other people, we're really looking at what is different in people that burn out, people that are cold, like a doctor that just comes in and says, oh, you have a problem, oh, okay, give medication and walks out again, that do not have that empathetic response. And people that are 30, 40 years in the professions of taking care of others. And what is different in these people? And we came to the conclusion, and there's a paper more being done on that, is that it's actually not an empathy, it's not a compassion burnout, it's an empathy burnout. People with too much empathy burn out because they are constantly resonating with the suffering, but they do not overcome by really engaging compassionately with the suffering. So there is a huge difference between people who have empathy and people who have compassion. So then we went back into the lab and started looking at, well, what does that mean for us as practitioners? Do we really practice empathy? And if so, can we hold and just stay in an empathy state and not move on into the compassion? Or is it that what we understood to be compassion is not really compassion, it's just empathy? So this is why I think it's very interesting and important also for contemplative practitioners to engage in this dialogue and this activity, because you learn a lot about the accuracy of your own practice and how that informed science can really be informative to bring you to understand when practice is off or on track. And on the other side, for scientists to engage with practitioners, because they can suddenly see that, oh, our assumption was wrong, because the practitioner tells us that this is not what's happening, or this is not what is really the idea about that. So, in order to go into more summary and conclusions, among novices who 2 weeks of compassion training changes the brain and increases altruistic behavior. This was also part that we were doing with people that wanted to learn on compassion training and what kind of, so we're developing different kinds of protocols that make this more accessible. And moreover, those with greater changes in brain function show greater altruistic behavior. So there's obviously not just the status quo, but there is also a capacity to improve. And it's, honestly speaking, it's boundless. This is really where it becomes boundless. And then the patterns differ in experts and novices. Experts are able to remain with suffering and show high levels of amygdala activation. Now, amygdala activation means mostly regarding fear and response-driven activities, which is critical to understand the definition of compassion, at least as I understand it in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It's the wish to relieve suffering, and that's the second part, the causes of suffering. And you become the cause of the suffering when you start engaging in compassionate activities. It's not just a wish, it's really engaging into that. So that obviously has to do with our motor cortex and the activity. And you can really see these differences in the brain by people that are just kind of like wanting to relieve the suffering, or want to really do something and be part of that, because the motor cortex in compassion is much more active than in empathy. So there are different parts of the brain that are active. And what novices reduce their amygdala activation with training, which means the disconnected and just, let's say, firing up of the amygdala activity without control is what is really first reduced, and then you can control it and actually engage in with suffering. Perhaps this is due to the increased capacity for equanimity among the experts. Now that's a hypothesis, but we don't know how to measure equanimity, so that's of course where the dialogue between scientists and contemplative practitioners becomes so interesting. You know, that they talk about things, the contemplative, that science has no access to. But science talks about things that also the contemplatives don't have access to. So that's why it's important to engage with each other and just try to, first, maybe formulate a common language, but really look at commonalities and concepts. Now, of course, that raises the question, why is human altruism important? Because altruism provides residual social insurance. Altruists help if needed. And if you're with an altruist together, and you are altruistic, you know you're going to be helped. And that's, of course, basic survival. But altruism increases the volume of mutually beneficial economic exchanges. And this is now really taken from the economic exchanges. And this I'm just using as a sort of as a teaser, because there are deeper implications to that. Altruism ensures that implicit agreements are kept, provided they distribute the mutual gains fairly. Now this is really economic topic. Altruism helps enforce cooperative norms that are the basis of modern democracy and individual liberties. We're in a society where individual liberties are so extremely important, but maybe we should start really considering them in the context of the community. Now what happens if we put a bunch of people that consider themselves to be compassionate, cooperative, altruist, and you introduce one person that is a cheater? And this has been done several times in many game theoretical experiments, where you have 10 people playing with each other, they do exchange, and one is a cheater. What starts happening in these games that are repeatedly done over, let's say, 10 repetitions of an economic exchange? The degree of cooperation decreases. It's very clear. If you're just among even as motivated altruists as possible, and you start looking at, oh, that person gets away with the cheating, well, maybe I can try that too, because I just want to have my benefit. At the end you have maybe just one that is still an altruist, and this is the number 10, and the others are all kind of like enmeshed in a game of not cooperation. Now you introduce a little piece of punishment. Now you have among those 10 one, and you announce there's one person that can actually punish you. You don't say who it is, but just the mere concept of that there is a punishment at the end of the game changes the same people into a suddenly cooperative nature. And it's the same people. So it's very important what context we create and what the outer conditions are, and in which context, with or without punishment opportunity. Now, of course, the quality of the punishment is a question that needs to be discussed. Is it just that you're getting slapped or being sent out, or you have to pay penalties? That's all for society, I think, to decide. But it's very interesting, at least in my mind, to see that cooperative behavior is not something that just spontaneously arises unless we understand the implications for our personal well-being and the group's well-being. So, why does cooperation flourish if altruistic sanctioning is possible? It's something that needs to be looked at. Maybe there is a form of altruistic punishment that would really bring us up to the degree of cooperation. Now, conclusions of what I have to say. Altruistic cooperation and sanctioning are vital for human welfare. There's no way we can deny that. If we look at our economic system, at societal strives, difficulties that we are facing, they're all because, or mostly environmental degradation, is because egoistic behavior is being sanctioned and even endorsed and even rewarded. But those days are gone. We cannot continue to operate on these levels. So the question then becomes, what is then public goods provision? We have to structure our social institutions, laws, norms in such a way that they take advantage of human altruism, which we have. We show it with the people that we like. Then they channel self-interest to pro-social goals. So that is what I have to say for today. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Hangdeno, for the interesting and insightful presentation. And here comes the Q&A sections. If you have any questions, please raise up your hand and our volunteer will get you a microphone.
Yes, concerning about your definition about the brain structure. What do you think is the difference between mind and brain? As far as I know, some kinds of meditation involve the flow of energy. Okay, this is not, I think it is not unnatural to most practitioners maybe here. That energy in the Chinese way may be called qi. It can be involved in a kind of what you call extending the cells will grow, something like that. Even as far as I know a little bit, some research even revealed that there is energy existing after people is dead. What do you think about your definition about brain? Would that, because if that also involves energy, that would be a big matter. Because as far as I know, sometimes energy, as far as some practitioners claim, they can emit the energy to the other people. So that form another platform for connecting people with this sort of energy. Okay, what's your opinion about that?
First of all, we need to understand how we define energy. So there is obviously electrical energy, there's solar energy, there is warmth is a form of energy, then there is like biological energy. Now, I don't know what is being addressed by these kind of different energies. Of course, as far as I know, qi as an energy is a term that sort of embodies a lot. But I don't know how that would be translatable into just the mere fact that a cell is alive. It's obviously qi is in there, but how that would then be visible in the context of a brain structure, it's definitely a different set of energy parameters that we're talking about. Now, mind and brain is not the same. It's definitely different. There is an idea about brain being the cause for mind to arise. Now, there's more and more research that struggles with this concept. And there's also a lot of research that tries to prove that, yes, mind is a product of the brain. Because if you don't have any brain, where is mind then? And I think this is a very, at the point where we're standing now, is we need to keep an open attitude about that. We cannot just limit it because we can't measure it, that this is what it is, or it's not because we can't measure it. So the same has to do with the mere fact that we are talking about systems, such as a physical system. Now there we don't talk about a biological continuation, for instance, of life. It's just a physical system. Now that in itself has an own language structure, it has an own way of looking at existence, but it excludes a lot, which is the biological functioning. Once we start talking about biological functions, then we have to introduce a new vocabulary. We have to look at new concepts. And I think that's exactly the same true for looking from biological system into a mental system. So there are certain areas which, of course, in the biological, they are based on a physical understanding of how electrons and molecules are interacting with each other. But that doesn't really define the quality of life. And I think that's the same true for mind. That we cannot reduce mental concepts and mental ways of operating and functioning to just mere biological structures. And that's for the brain. So when you look at the brain, it's obvious it's a biological structure. It has an incredible capacity to regenerate and continue. But then sort of say that this is a mind, it's a mind, is not the correct way to look at that. Does that help? You are the MC. So please try to make your questions short so that I can answer more questions.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, Diego. I have a few questions, and I'll be brief. In hypnosis is a state of highly focused concentration. So I'm curious if they've done any studies which look at the difference in the brain structures when people are in a deep state of trance. There's one question. Another question is, from my experience, personally, if I'm meditating on compassion, it's more of a heartfelt sense than a cognitive focus. I'd like you to comment on that. And just thirdly, you've probably heard the term stupidity meditation, when you're kind of in la-la land, and you're in a quiet space, but you're not focused. Is there any benefit to that kind of meditation, or is it only the focused meditation that's been studied?
The first question about hypnosis, I don't know. There might be, but I'm not a researcher myself. So I'm more of a facilitator of these dialogues. I'm sure that somebody might know about that. I don't know. Second piece about, what was that? The heartfelt. Heartfelt, yes, of course, it is. Compassion and loving kindness is actually the felt wish for the suffering to decrease in compassion or for well-being. So I don't know where to place that. There is, of course, a lot of strong connection between the heart, and there's more and more research now emerging that looks at the vagus tone. The vagus tone is actually one of the nerves that connects the brain to the heart, and basically it's in direct connection and communication with the brain. And there's, for instance, the capacity of the vagus nerve to respond quicker and increase, for instance, the pulse of the heart seems to be correlated to certain states of meditation or also just of brain activity. So there is a strong connection. There's no doubt about that. Now, in regard to the La-La Land, I do think that there is no benefit in being in that dull state. In Tibetan, they talk about Qing-Ge. And Qingwa is when the mind is super active. And so that's when you have actually constant distraction. When you're not really at what shamatha is supposed to be doing, which is keep the mind at the calm, abiding state. The other one is dullness, and that competes with each other. It's not about being active, it's not about being dull, it's about being present. Now when we talk about, particularly in the shamatha practice, where you try to calm the mind and to really keep it focused, there you try to look at developing the three qualities that shamatha practice is aimed at, which is stable, peaceful, but clear. So dullness or la-la land is definitely not beneficial. But to get to that, one needs to practice and really be able to clearly identify when the mind is slipping or is being sort of overactive.
No, excuse me. Two questions, very brief one. First one is about the lazy person's meditation practice. As a scientist, would you aspire to invent a machine which simulates the result of meditation practice? So you plant some electrodes to the brain and then you get the result of, say, of a monk who has been practicing for 30, 40 years. This is my first question. The second one is still deals with consciousness. Now, we have a lot of articles or writings about out-of-body experience or near-death experience, in which say a person who is nearly on his near-death will have the consciousness split from his body. That means that the consciousness can exist independently of a physical clinging to the brain or the heart or the mind or any body matter. So can you comment on this consciousness thing, namely what is the property of consciousness? Has it got any wavelength property or resonance or vibration, whatever? And also now, this also relates to the Tibetan school training of life and death. Say a person who is dying will become a sort of bardo state before the samsara carries him or her to the next life. So what is consciousness all about?
Now let me remind the first question, because I think that I can answer that easier. What was the first question? The machine, yes. Well, the machine, I think, is wishful thinking, because we are constantly conditioned by the interaction with our sense perceptions, for instance. And these 6 sense perceptions, they are in constant exchange and informing our brain, and I'm just talking now here about the brain, and developing the brain structure that is necessary for the brain to be operating the way it is right now with what we have. But that is only an evolutionary constant conditioning that actually creates those brain structure. It is, of course, possible to take a tablet and basically go into an incredible state of bliss, for instance, but it's not sustainable. That's the problem. And so, in order for us to create a sustainable clarity, we need to create the causes and conditions that really build up that clarity, and that's only possible through training. So there might be certain devices that help us in order to become more stable at whatever status we want, but it doesn't come with all the other qualities that actually practice is aimed at, which has to do with ethics. So you might be able to continuously keep your focus at one object, but it's not really developing the other qualities that actually the whole Buddhist path is at least aimed at, which is developing ethical behavior. And that's part of the path. So I do think that's quite wishful thinking, that we need probably to do a lot of effort on the way to get really to that state without these tools. And I think that's also why the Buddha really has spoken to why is it that we do not get those qualities that are of a clean mind or of a pure mind, because we lack effort. And of course, we all want to sort of cheat a little bit on the way. So that probably answers also your question about consciousness. Consciousness is really not limited to one aspect of, let's say, focus. or being in a bardo state, or being just in the body. Now, in research, that is, as far as I'm concerned and I know, is really very remote. The possibility at this point to 100% confirm or disprove the capacity of the mind to be within the body or without the body. So I think that's, if we were able to develop, let's say, a program where people die consciously and return consciously, and sort of go through that maybe 10 times within 2 years, where the money of research program runs out, that might be possible, but I don't see that really in the close future. So that has to do with consciousness.
Maybe at the back. Yep. The middle one. Yep.
Very interesting topic. In your presentation, you mentioned that the quality of the meditation is very important.
Yeah.
If we want to do the research about the meditation, how can control or measure the quality of meditation? Do you have any idea or any suggestion?
No, I think that's what we were just discussing that at the last Summer Research Institute, where you came up about the quality. How do you measure the quality? And the only way you can really sort of assess that, it seems, is by reports of the person. And you have to have the honest reports. And of course, nobody wants to be seen as like, oh, I'm really a bad meditator. but you still need to have that feedback. And of course, when you look at certain degrees of eye movement, for instance, that's one way how you can really say that the person is focused on an external object. But how about an internal object? You don't need eye movement for that. Is it closed? Is it open? The one experiment that I showed you about these, the gamma oscillation and the correlation with the person that is really doing, engaging him or herself about, and this, by the way, I just want to make sure that you all have heard that. It's not only monks that have been participating in these experiments and are long-term practitioners or nuns. There are also lay people, like obviously you saw me there. So this is not something that is limited to, it's just practitioners. But the quality is extremely difficult to gauge. So how would you define the quality of having taken a meal from outside? The sweetness of a meal. You can't. You have to actually experience it. You have to take it. And then you can start comparing, oh, this was very sweet or was not so sweet. And then gradually you develop a security or a sort of a confidence about saying, well, this is kind of more or less. But that's why we're doing all that. Yeah, these two. Yeah.
Thank you for a very stimulating, mentally stimulating presentation. I was wondering, you were talking about mental plasticity. What are the triggers for mental plasticity, and what is a consciousness's part in mental plasticity, or what you were saying?
I was more referring to brain plasticity. Mental is extremely plastic anyway. I mean, but plasticity is basically what we refer to objects that are sort of a shape. Mental doesn't have a shape, doesn't have a color, doesn't have a taste. So talking about plasticity, I think in this context is a bit would be misappropriated, because it is per se moving, not fixed. Is in that sense plastic and it's constantly changing. Now, of course, if we look at our own trajectory of our personality, it has been changing, it has been moving, it has been constantly moving from, let's say, a person that we were not able to think to somebody that is able to think. We dream, if we go through certain experiences, we dream about them. So the mind is constantly changing. So, does that help?
Yeah, I was just wondering about plasticity then, I guess.
Okay, now plasticity is really the capacity to change shape and have, according to that, a different structure. It's like plastilene or clay that you press and move and shape. That's the idea of plasticity. But then, of course, because of our brain being of a certain structure, the training that we give to the brain changes the structure. And that is what in neuroscientific terminology is actually a downward causation, where mental processes are really informing and shaping the result in the brain. So the brain changes according to what we think, what we do, what we train. But there is also, of course, a conditioning from the brain that's the upward causation to the mind. If we have a brain damage, there are certain functions that we lose. But because of mental training, we can actually reactivate those to a certain degree. Maybe these two, and then
yeah.
Buddha got the development of his
weak meditation.
Can neutral scientists describe this kind of change?
Well, I think there would be. Can I rephrase your question so that I have understood it properly? You were saying that Buddha attained enlightenment after 1 week of meditation, and can neuroscience sort of prove what state that enlightenment would be? I think they would be really interested in bringing somebody that is enlightened into the lab. But I think that needs to be first found. Maybe there is people that are enlightened, but they don't go to the lab. So I don't think that, to my mind, and I'm not a neuroscientist, I just want to declare, and please forgive if there are neuroscientists here that I have made some claim, but I think that neuroscience will not be able to define what enlightenment is on the basis of a physiological structure of a brain. I don't think so.
Perhaps you can have last question from this gentleman.
My twin brother and I are identical twins, and we often have mental telepathy ever since we were kids. If you are suffering from acute sickness, like after an operation, even I'm healthy here, but I still feel his pain. When I was operated on my nose after rugby league, broken nose for 2 weeks, his nose was blocked for 2 weeks in Canada.
Wow.
There's now still going on, first of all. Secondly, what I wanted to say is, no matter what type of experiment the scientists are doing, meditation, you need practice, and there's no quick fix. You need practice. When after you have a lot of practice, as Reverend Hinong had said, they change your way of thinking. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. May you all be happy and continue to flourish.
Before the lecture ends, may I invite Venerable Hin Hong to present a souvenir to Dr. Hannibal?
Oh.
Oh, yes. It's writing by one of the most famous masters in Hong Kong. And it's a phrase from the Heart Sutra.
From the Heart Sutra?
Yes. So, this is for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. What does it mean? I mean, I know the Heart Sutra, but which part?
Where your mind has no more attachment, no more worry.
May that be true for all of you.
Thanks for coming and hope to see you again.
Thank you.